Saving the Appearances, A Study in Idolatry by Owen Barfield, 2nd edition. 4. Participation. In the last few decades, this whole question of the figurative makeup of collective representations and the theoretical confusion between what I have called figuration and what I have called alpha thinking has been implicitly raised by certain anthropologists. Putting it in a nutshell, they have suggested by the whole manner of their approach to the workings of the primitive mind, the question, can there be such a thing as they thought they saw? Of course, two people can make the same momentary mistake about the identity of an imperfectly seen object. But as we saw in Chapter 2, the generally accepted criterion of the difference between I thought I saw and I found it was is that the former is a private, the latter a collective representation. How then if the they are a whole tribe or population? If the mistake is not momentary but a permanent one? If it is passed down for centuries from generation to generation? If, in fact, it is never followed by a they found it was? The difficulty is that then the mistake is itself a collective representation. And yet for ourselves, as we saw, it is precisely the collectivity of our representations which is the accepted test of their reality. It is this which convinces us that they are not mistakes or hallucinations. Why not then also for them, the primitive tribe? But this is to go too fast. The earlier anthropologists assume as a matter of course that the primitive peoples who still survive in various parts of the earth perceive and think in the same way as we do, but that they think incorrectly. The assumption which underlies their whole approach to the subject is effectively epitomized in two sentences from Tyler's Primitive Culture, first published in 1871. It was no spontaneous fancy, but the reasonable inference that effects are due to causes, which led the rude men of olden days to people with such ethereal phantoms their own houses and haunts, and the vast earth and sky beyond. Spirits are personified causes. This theory of an inferring followed by a peopling, which is usually called animism, but which Durkheim prefers to call naturism, is moreover, according to Lévi-Bruhl, especially typical of the English school of anthropology, and he attributes this, rightly or wrongly, to the influence of Herbert Spencer, who assumed so readily that all things evolve from simple to complex. Be that as it may, the theory is attacked by the 20th century anthropologists to whom I have referred. They deny the inferring and question the peopling. Lévi-Bruhl himself, for instance, insists, in the light of the evidence, that to ask how the primitive mind would explain this or that natural phenomenon is a wrongly formulated question. The explanation is implied in the collective representations themselves. When we find a primitive mind incapable of grasping what is, to us, the self-evident law of contradiction, it is absurd to imagine such a mind thinking in terms of cause and effect, and of inference from one to the other. Rather, we are in contact with a different kind of thinking and a different kind of perceiving altogether. Lévi-Bruhl describes this pre-logical mentality, which he says is essentially synthetic. By this I mean that the syntheses which compose it do not imply previous analyses of which the result has been registered in definite concepts, as is the case with those in which logical thought operates. In other words, the connecting links of the representations are given, as a rule, in the representations themselves. This is also found to be a more satisfactory and convincing approach to the phenomenon of totemism, which involves the most inexplicable and, to us, nonsensical identifications and distinctions. To make no class distinction between the sun and a white cockatoo, but to feel instantly and sharply a world of difference between both of these natural phenomena and a black cockatoo is, it is felt, a state of mind at which it would be difficult to arrive by inference. The elements which the totem-conscious mind selects out of the whole representation for attention are often very, very different from those which we select. Often, for instance, it is not much interested in the distinction between animate and inanimate, including artificial, objects. Almost everything that we see therein, i.e., in a being or object or natural phenomenon, escapes their attention or is a matter of indifference to them. On the other hand, they see many things of which we are unconscious. This leads Lévi-Brühl to the conclusion that primitives see with eyes like ours, but they do not perceive with the same minds. And he adds, "It is not correct to maintain, as is frequently done, that the primitives associate occult powers, magical properties, a kind of soul or vital principle with all the objects which affect their senses or strike the imagination, and that their perceptions are surcharged with animistic beliefs. It is not a question of association. The mystic properties with which things are imbued form an integral part of the idea to the primitive who views it as a synthetic whole. It is at a larger stage of social evolution that what we call a natural phenomenon tends to become the sole content of perception to the exclusion of other elements which then assume the aspect of beliefs, and finally appear superstitions. But as long as this dissociation does not take place, perception remains an undifferentiated whole. It may be questioned whether the epithet mystic, as it is used here, and in the expression participation mystique, which is essentially associated with the name of Lévi-Brühl, adds effectively to his meaning. Elsewhere, he has defined the precise significance which he intends by it, and I shall revert to this shortly. What is important is the concept of participation. The principal reason which Lévi-Brühl, Durkheim, and others assign for the fact that primitives do not perceive with the same minds as ours is that in the act of perception they are not detached, as we are, from the representations. For us, the only connection of which we are conscious is the external one through the senses. Not so for them. Thus, for Lévi-Brühl, the collective representations and interconnections which constitute such a primitive mentality are governed by the law of participation, and insofar as they take but little account of the law of contradiction. He speaks of a veritable symbiosis between the totemic group and its totem, and tells us that if we seek to penetrate their mental processes, we must understand the same by virtue, not of the law of identity, but of the law of participation. Durkheim seeks to carry much further the bearing of anthropological inquiry on the origin and evolution of abstract thought. He affirms, for instance, that the identification of persons and individual phenomena with totems violates the principle of contradiction only as predication does in our own thinking. The root or predecessor of predication is to be found in the use of totemic emblems by clans to express and communicate collective representations. We shall see that this same expression and communication are today the function of language. Participation begins by being an activity, and essentially a communal or social activity. It takes place in rites and initiation ceremonies, resulting in collective mental states of extreme emotional intensity in which representation is as yet undifferentiated from the movements and actions which make the communion towards which it tends a reality to the group. Their participation in it is so effectively lived that it is not yet properly imagined. This stage is not only pre-logical, but also pre-mythical. It is anterior to collective representations themselves, as I have been using the term. Thus, the first development Durkheim traces is from symbiosis or active participation, where the individual feels he is the totem, to collective representations of the totemic type, where the individual feels that his ancestors were the totem, and that he will be when he dies, etc. From this symbolic apprehension, he then arrives at the duality with which we are more familiar, of ideas on the one hand and numinous religion on the other. This extrasensory participation of the percipient in the representation involves a similar link between the representations themselves and, of course, between the percipient and another. Manna, or waken, which we can only translate by abstract terms like totemic principle, life principle, or, since it is present also in inanimate objects, being, is anterior to the individuality of the persons and objects. These, says Durkheim, are rather apprehended by the very primitive as stopping places of manna. It is incidentally here that he finds the prototype of the idea of force, which played such a prominent part in the physical science of the 19th century. And in emphasizing the religious origin of this idea, he points out, rather appositely, that Comte regarded the notion of force as a superstition which was destined to disappear from science, as indeed it has shown marked signs of doing since Durkheim's book was published. I hope I have not misrepresented either of the two anthropologists from whom I have quoted rather freely, the more so as I cannot pause to consider the adverse criticism which Lévi-Bruhl in particular has aroused. I doubt if it was his case that all primitives invariably think in the pre-logical way. It is certainly not mine. If I have drawn heavily on these two writers, I have done so by way of illustration rather than argument. It is not very difficult to see what they mean, and, by seeing what they mean, the reader may possibly be helped to see what I mean. Collective representations do not imply a collective unity distinct from the individuals comprising the social group. On the other hand, their existence does not derive from the individual. In these two respects, they may be compared to language. Like the words of a language, they are common to the members of a given social group and are transmitted from one generation to another, developing and changing only gradually in the process. Moreover, it is impossible to draw a very precise line between representations and beliefs about representations, or, in the terms I have been using, between figuration and alpha thinking. All collective representations involve figuration, and therefore, if figuration is a kind of thinking, involve thought. But in addition to this, nearly all of them involve elements which are actually apprehended as thoughts, or imagined rather than as perceived. It was this, presumably, which persuaded Lévi-Bruhl to add the word mystic to his participation. He uses it, he says, in the strictly defined sense in which mystic implies belief in forces and influences and actions, which thought imperceptible to sense are nevertheless real. When I see a stone fall to the ground, do I believe that it is drawn by a force or the law of gravity? When I use the telephone, do I believe that my correspondent's voice is recorded and reproduced by an invisible called electricity? Or are both these thoughts immediately experienced in my representation? Or is one so and not the other? The exact point at which a piece of alpha thinking has slipped into and become an integral part of the representation is hard to determine and may clearly differ somewhat between individuals of the same social group and for the same individual at different times. It is continually happening while we are growing up, especially while we are learning to speak. I say, I hear a thrush singing outside my window. But do I? He is invisible, and it might perhaps be a blackbird. I have begun the business of thinking and believing already. The same thing happens to a lifelong birdwatcher. He does no thinking at all. He recognizes. He hears a thrush singing. For him, alpha thinking has become figuration. To sum up what has been said in this chapter, anthropology began by assuming as a matter of course that primitive peoples perceive the same phenomena as we do, and on that assumption investigated their beliefs about these phenomena. Now, however, some anthropologists have begun to point out that the difference between the primitive outlook and ours begins at an earlier stage. It is not only a different alpha thinking, but a different figuration with which we have to do, and therefore the phenomena are treated as collective representations produced by that different figuration. It is further maintained by some of them that the most striking difference between primitive figuration and ours is that the primitive involves participation. That is, an awareness which we no longer have of an extrasensory link between the percipient and the representations. This involves not only that we think differently, but that the phenomena, collective representations, themselves are different. The first 3 chapters were devoted to reminding the reader that we do, in fact, still participate in the phenomena, though, for the most part, we do so unconsciously. We can only remind ourselves of that participation by beta thinking, and we forget it again as soon as we leave off. This is the fundamental difference, not only between their thinking and ours, but also between their phenomena and ours. It remains to consider how ours, which are genetically the latter, have come to pass. 5. Prehistory. A history of the world, as distinct from a history of the unrepresented, must clearly be a history of phenomena, that is, of collective representations. But before this part of the subject is approached, it will be well to consider briefly the bearing of this truth on what is sometimes called prehistory. I mean, in particular, the history of the earth before the appearance on it of human beings. When particles of rain, rays of light, and our watching eyes are appropriately disposed, we see a rainbow. In the same way, given the existence of the particles and the presence of human beings on the earth, there arise collective representations, or, in other words, the phenomena which we call nature. When dealing with times in which these conditions were present, therefore, it is quite reasonable to describe and investigate nature scientifically, not only in the manner of physics, but also in the manner of the sciences whose field of study is the past as well as the present, such as geology, ecology, zoology, and to do all this as if the phenomena were wholly independent of man's sensory and psychological participation. It is not necessarily misleading to do so, and it has proved to be of great practical use. It is, however, not sufficiently realized that different considerations apply to any description, in familiar terms, of natural events and processes deemed to have taken place before the appearance of human life on earth. It may, of course, be contended, though I should not like the task, that some animals enjoy representations sufficiently coherent to set up a phenomenal whole, which could be called a world or nature. But this does not really assist much, for although animals appeared on earth before man, it is certainly not their world or nature which geology, for instance, describes. And even so, there remains the whole vast panorama of prehistory which is assumed to have preceded the emergence on this planet of sentient life of any description. Yet by combining, say, biology and geology, and omitting physics and physiology, such descriptions are continually offered to us and form, I suppose, a recognized part of the education of most children today. It can do no harm to recall occasionally that the prehistoric evolution of the earth, as it is described, for example, in the early chapters of H.G. Wells's Outline of History, was not merely never seen. It never occurred. Something no doubt occurred, and what is really being propounded by such popular writers and, so far as I am aware, by the textbooks on which they rely is this: that at the time the unrepresented was behaving in such a way that if human beings with the collective representations characteristic of the last few centuries of Western civilization had been there, the things described would also have been there. This is not quite the same thing. It needs, I should have thought, to be considered in connection with another fact, namely, that when attention is expressly directed to the history of the unrepresented, as in calculations of the age of the Earth based on radioactivity, it is invariably assumed that the behavior of the unrepresented has remained fundamentally unchanged. Moreover, and this is to my mind more important, for those hypothetical human beings with collective representations characteristic of the last few centuries of Western civilization, we might choose to substitute other human beings, those, for instance, who lived 1 or 2 or 3 or more 1,000 years ago. We should then have to write a different prehistory altogether. And we are not entitled to assume without inquiry that, as an indirect means of suggesting the truth about prehistoric goings-on in the unrepresented, such an alternative model would be any less efficient than the one we have in fact chosen. It might be very much more so. As these consequences may be startling enough to the reader to cause him to reject them, even though he has so far followed me with sympathy, I will, at the risk of repeating myself, put as clearly as I can the alternatives to accepting them. If we refuse to accept them, we can adopt one of 3 courses, to each of which there are, to me, insuperable objections. We can adopt a sort of super-naive realism, rejecting all the rigmarole of physics, physiology, and psychology, with the healthy instinct of Dr. Johnson kicking his stone. Nature is nature, and the earth is the earth, and always has been since it all began. This may do for the present moment, but for a scientifically reconstructed prehistoric past, it is open to the objection that, if we are going to reject the reasoned inferences of one set of scientists, there seems no particular reason why we should accept those of another. Or we can resort frankly to double-think. We can think that what physics tells us is true when we are studying physics, and untrue when we are studying something else. The objections to this course are obvious to me, and will be equally so to some of my readers. There are those who will nevertheless continue to adopt it. This book is addressed to the others. Lastly, we can adopt a Berkeleyan view of phenomena. For Berkeley held that not merely the unrepresented, but the representations as such are sustained by God in the absence of human beings. This involves the, for me, too difficult corollary that, out of all the wide variety of collective representations which are found even today over the face of the earth, and the still wider variety which history unrolls before us, God has chosen for his delight the particular set shared by Western man in the last few centuries. It does not, of course, necessarily follow that all the current descriptions of prehistory are absurd. Even if the usual way of recording what, in the absence of man, was going on in the unrepresented must be criticized as a dubious extrapolation, the descriptions may still, as I have suggested, be valuable, not as actual descriptions, but as notional models. What is important is to remember that that is all they are. Especially will this be the case if we should ever have to access the merits of this approach against those of any other possible way of acquiring knowledge of the prehistoric past. For their nature is that of artificial imagery. And when the nature and limitations of artificial images are forgotten, they become idols. Francis Bacon declared that the medieval approach to reality was under the spell of 4 different sorts of idols, which he called idols of the cave, idols of the tribe, and so forth. In the same way, these images of what was going on in the unrepresented, in the prehistoric past, may be called idols of the study. At least that is what they are, if their nature and limitations are forgotten. And I am not sure that as yet these have even been noticed. It is, however, not only these purely theoretical or academic idols with which this book is concerned.